Mothers, fathers, sons and daughters, collectively punished, threatened by bombs and bullets, barely existing, barely eating, shivering with fear, stripped of humanity, praying for survival. Those who watch from afar are fortunate to be only horrified bystanders and outraged spectators. 1 year of terror, 12 months of suffering, 365 days of unimaginable pain. Hundreds of families on the Gaza Strip have been erased from their records in the past 12 months. The dead are gone and their loss is mourned. The survivors know they may be next. Many of the wounded have suffered life-changing injuries, and as the war enters the second year, there's only one thing for certain: there will be more suffering. From Gaza, Ashraf Shannon reports.
Alma Jarour is the sole survivor after her parents and all of her siblings were killed in an Israeli airstrike on Gaza City in December. Dozens of her extended family members were also killed in the same attack.
My father and mother and all of my brothers and sisters were killed. An Israeli airstrike targeting Al-Yor mosque near our house. I was injured and we fled to my uncle's house and it was also bombed. I was buried under the rubble for 3 hours, and after I was rescued, I found out all of my family members were killed and their bodies were torn to pieces.
She currently lives with the family of her aunt's husband.
Alma Jarour's entire family was killed when her uncle's house was bombed. More than 100 people were sheltering in that house when it was bombed. Alma was the only survivor, and I took her in, and now she lives with my children, and I take care of her like the rest of my children.
Israel's massacre in Gaza since October 7th has created misery and suffering for more than 1.9 million Palestinians in the occupied Gaza Strip. Manal Judah is another child who lost her entire family during an Israeli attack. She currently lives with her maternal grandmother, who has been helping her overcome the traumatic events she experienced by teaching her Quran recitals.
I'm Manal's grandmother, and she's the sole survivor of her family. 68 members of her family, including her parents and her extended family, were killed during an airstrike. She lost both parents and 3 brothers in that attack, and I'm taking care of her now.
The loss of large family groups is tearing holes in Gaza's social fabric. Throughout Israel's massacre in Gaza, there have been countless reports of whole families dying in Israeli airstrikes, including uncles, aunts, cousins, and grandparents. Ashraf Shannon, TRT World, Gaza.
The latest war between two long-standing enemies is threatening an entire people and their land. In fact, it's both sides making that claim. Today on TRT World, we're marking 1 year since the start of the conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Benjamin Netanyahu says his country is in an existential war. The Palestinians, well, they just want their own country. Netanyahu is not all of Israel. Hamas is not all of Gaza. But at the direction of its longer-serving leader, Israel is accused of committing war crimes against millions of innocent Palestinian civilians. Nothing happens in a vacuum, and the catalyst for the latest conflict, which many say is a genocide by Israel, it began with the Hamas attack inside Israeli territory on October the 7th last year. Throughout the day, we're going to be hearing from our correspondents and contributors across the region.
I'm Imran Garda, and I'll be giving you coverage from occupied East Jerusalem throughout the day, as it's hard to imagine that so much killing and destruction could have happened just in the past year alone.
It's been a long.
I'm Mohammed Al-Qasim in occupied East Jerusalem. I have been covering this war since it started exactly 1 year ago on October 7th. Stay with us on TRT World to bring you a comprehensive coverage of this 1 year war on Gaza and more.
I'm Ashraf Shan. I've been covering the war for the entire year, and I'll be bringing you the latest.
Okay, so let's just keep Ashraf and Mohammed Al-Qasim with us for a few minutes. Ashraf, we're going to start with you because obviously you have been our eyes and ears in the Gaza Strip. Foreign journalists are not allowed in the enclave on order of the Israelis. 12 months of your life spent reporting while dodging bombs and bullets. Tell us about your experience, your family, your friends, about you, the person, Ashraf.
Well, Adnan, I don't know where to begin. It's been so much trauma, so much destruction, so much death over the last year that you can't even begin to what to describe or how to describe what happened during the past year. For me, for my personal experience, on the fourth day of the war, my house was bombed and completely destroyed, in addition to my entire neighborhood. 3 days before that, we were displaced 3 times. And we continued, this displacement continued till this day, over a dozen times. We had to see friends, loved ones, family members, colleagues being killed or wounded since the beginning of the war. You work all your life, to build a house, to raise a family, and all of a sudden, everything just completely gone. Children, they're all over, the towns, and some of them had to leave the country, and you can't even imagine if one day you will be back together or be able to build that house that was destroyed, or to be reunited with the family you always loved. It's very hard. It's very hard for us journalists, very hard for everyone. It's been a very difficult experience, one of probably the most difficult experiences I ever had in my life. I've covered wars since 2008. I've never seen such destruction, such suffering, such horror that people had to go through it now.
Ashraf, today is very much a day about people. We're going to talk a lot about politics. We're going to look at the humanitarian situation that you've been observing for yourself. We'll look at the military analysis as well. But today is about people. And what I'm hearing in your voice is the difficulty in your finding to express those personal emotions. Because I understand as a professional, you have a job to do, and maybe you're separating the two to be able to do your job most effectively. The journalism is one thing. But again, you're talking to us about your life and that of your family and your friends. And I can understand how that becomes more difficult to process compared to the journalism. The younger members of your family, your nephews, your nieces, the children that walk behind you, so often they're smiling. If they're lucky, they're holding a bottle of water. Those are the people who may find it most difficult to understand what you, the people of Gaza, are going through. What do you say to the youngest people who can talk and have some understanding that their lives are in danger?
You know what's really hard, Adnan, as a grown-up, you don't know what to do with what's going on. So you can't imagine how are you going to explain to a child that things will get better, that their life will improve, especially if a child loses a limb, lost his hand, lost his leg, lost his eye, or lost his parents, his mom, his dad or her dad. It's really difficult to try to, to soothe their feelings, try to, give them some sort of moral support. It's very hard. And this is happening on a daily basis for an entire year. For me as a journalist, you have to deal, with the wife, with your kids, and your relatives, your friends, your neighbors, people walking down the street. A lot of people come to you, ask you questions when this war is going to end. You don't know when. Nobody knows when. And you try to tell people, soon it's going to end. So just try to give them hope, because hope is the only thing that those children and also the adults, that's the only thing that these people have to stay alive for a year now, after losing their livelihoods, losing their homes, losing their loved ones, losing their relatives, basically losing everything that they ever worked for.
You know how I always end our two ways, and it's always going to be the same. Stay safe. Ashraf, thanks a lot. Let's go to my colleague Mohammed Al-Qasim, who's in occupied East Jerusalem. Mohammed, really the same issue for you. 12 months, and do you have one particular searing memory that you'll never, ever forget?
Well, probably, Adnan, the most incredible memory that I've had when I visited one of the local hospitals in occupied East Jerusalem soon after the war erupted, where several families, mothers who have been cut off from communicating with their families back in Gaza as a result of the war, they are at this local hospital, Al-Maqasid, or another hospital here in occupied East Jerusalem, with their children who are being treated for cancer. First, they're fearful, afraid, concerned for their families back in Gaza, but at the same time, they're concerned about what's going to happen to them here in occupied East Jerusalem, whether they're going to be kicked out of the hospital and maybe sent back to Gaza with their cancer-ridden kids, children. This one kid, Ali, that as soon as I got into his room, honestly, I couldn't hold back. I remember with my colleague, the cameraman, Hamza, I looked at him, I told him to sit up, and I went outside the room. Children can look at things completely different. They're full of hope, full of enthusiasm. And when you see this, and when you see them trying to be treated, when you see doctors trying their best and nurses to comfort them, but at the same time they're asking, how come I can't talk to my father or my little brother? These things sit with you. The thousands of Palestinian workers from Gaza, about 18,500 of them, who used to work in Israel, and on the day of October the 7th, they were so afraid that they just wanted to run back either to Gaza if they can, or hide in the occupied West Bank, find a way, pay whatever money they're asked to pay just to be smuggled back, even though they all had permits to work in Israel. But the attack on Palestinians that day from Israelis was unheard of. We witnessed that firsthand. And what are you going to tell a father who's begging you to give him your phone so he can call his wife or his parents or his children back in the Gaza Strip? They were beaten. They had to walk for miles to cross into the occupied West Bank. And even when they did that, they were put in centers, and eventually they were arrested by the Israeli security forces. There are so many, countless stories, Adnan, that I can go on and on and on, whether the experiences that we journalists had to deal with near Gaza borders after the attacks, whether from the Israeli security forces, the harassment, the physical attack that we faced, the restrictions on our broadcast of the news. And we pride ourselves of being objective, of being just storytellers, to take ourselves out of the story, whether in central Israel or even in northern Israel. So there are countless experiences, and I joke with my colleagues here and say, once this is all over, I think we all should just sit down and write a book on our experiences. But we're hopeful that this whole nightmare can end and end quickly. But there are so many human stories that can be told in this 1 year. And I have to tell you, Adnan, and I really, one of those people don't like to personalize things, but I can't believe that it's been already a year. I never thought that we would be standing here talking about this, and the war is still ongoing on Gaza.
You're playing an invaluable role in telling the world what's happening, Mohammed. Thank you for the moment. Mohammed Al-Qasim in occupied East Jerusalem. Brendan Kieran Brown is in the studio here with me. He's an assistant professor on conflict resolution and reconciliation at Trinity College in Dublin. Hatem Bazian is joining us from the United States, professor of Middle Eastern cultures and languages at the University of California, Berkeley. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your time. Brendan, welcome back to the studio. We know that you've researched, lived, you have friends in the occupied territories, especially the West Bank. What have they been telling you over the past 12 months while you've been talking to them?
Well, thanks as always for having me here. Yeah, they've been telling me of unimaginable horror, unimaginable destruction of family members being targeted in Gaza, the huge destruction that they've seen taking place. The loss is just incalculable, really. People's entire livelihoods have been disrupted, destroyed, and you can't even believe that we're sitting here 1 year on having to have these same conversations. It feels like we're on repeat.
Where's the conflict resolution and reconciliation here?
Honestly, I have no idea. For the first time in a long time, say 14 years of working in and for Palestine, I don't know where we go next. It's extremely precarious. You can see what's happening around the region. You know, everything seems to be getting ramped up and escalating as opposed to finding any solution to moving forward. But at the end of the day, the key thing we always need to centre in all of this is you stop this conflict by ending the occupation. You stop this conflict by removing the apartheid regime, by holding Israel to account for what it's been doing for not just this year, for 75, 76 years before. That is the only resolution to all of this. You can't bomb your way to a solution here.
This is where we're going to come to as well. As we look at the future, not only do we have to see the future for the people of Gaza, for the possibility of a two-state solution, but also where do the people of Gaza get their security from? Does it come from these kind of actions that Hamas instigated on October the 7th? We'll find out exactly what their reasoning was, or do they find it somewhere else? Is there an external actor who can bring security? We'll talk about all of those throughout the day, and you're with us for many, many hours. Let's just look at the scale and impact of what's been happening over the past 12 months, okay? Every single eyewitness from an international organization, whether it's a political or a humanitarian one, they say the same thing. They've never witnessed such a brutal assault on human beings or such a devastating impact on civilian infrastructure. So we have some numbers. These are just numbers. They illuminate the scale of the disaster. But remember, we're talking about people. More than 41,000 Gazans have been killed. That includes more than 6,000 women and 11,000 children. More than 97,000 people, reaching 100,000 injured. Hundreds of journalists and workers have also been killed. We've just heard that about 200 doctors at least have been killed. 2/3 of Gaza's buildings have been damaged or destroyed. The gradual discussion of Khan Yunis, just look at the satellite imagery. This, one of the southernmost cities in the entire strip, before and after. More than 80% of health facilities have been affected. Fewer than half of Gaza's hospitals are still operating. More than 90% of schools have been damaged. Infrastructure like water treatment and power plants have been rendered ineffectual. That has compromised the health of the population. At least 1.9 million people across the strip, they're internally displaced, about 90% of the entire population. Many people have been displaced repeatedly. This is important. Every time people move, they take fewer and fewer essentials with them. Eventually, they end up with almost nothing. Conditions in refugee camps are dire. There's insufficient food, water, and shelter. The squalid conditions are spreading disease. Polio is back for the first time in 25 years. So we talk about accountability, Brendan. An Oxfam report shows that apart from the 6-day humanitarian pause in November, there have only been 2 days of no bombings. Many people say that external actors that we're talking about, who they hope may bring peace, are actually complicit in what's going on because Israel is being allowed to do this.
Absolutely. I mean, you get an end to this as well by stopping supplying the weapons. I mean, you wouldn't have these bombs being dropped on Palestine, on people in Gaza, if you didn't have American weapons in the region. So it's very clear that there's plenty of opprobrium to go around here, and it can be pointed at the European Union, it can be pointed at the Americans as well, and everybody needs to take a step back and look at their role and responsibility in this, because you could, as I say, you could stop this. This doesn't have to be happening, it could be stopped, and that's the real disaster in all of this as well. This is avoidable.
That Oxfam report also says Israeli explosive weapons hit on average homes every 4 hours, tents and temporary shelters every 17 hours, schools and hospitals every 4 days, aid distribution points and warehouses every 15 days. That appears to be something designed to break the minds of people, because you're not just hitting military targets here. A distribution warehouse, a hospital. We know what the Israelis are saying Hamas operates amongst the civilian population. Every time we ask that question, we hear, do you think the people are stupid of Gaza, that they would be living with Hamas? They would just become targets. And we hear that that is not the case. And so what is happening here in terms of people being targeted?
I mean, you've summed it up perfectly. The goal here is erasure. The goal here is to get rid of the Gaza Strip as we understand it and as we know it. It is not about eradicating Hamas or a threat. It is to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip. That is what has been happening. That is what people have been warning and shouting about for the last year. And in fact, long before this as well. The aim is to make Gaza completely unlivable. Why else would you target food centres? Why else would you target sanitation facilities? Why else would you destroy the water? Why else would you allow diseases such as polio, etc., to run rampant? The aim here is erasure. It's not about containment and management. And that's what we should be completely devastated by, really. And that's what we have seen for this awful last year.
And that's what South Africa, Turkey and other countries who have joined that case at the International Court of Justice are accusing Israel of.
Exactly, yeah.
Contravening the Genocide Convention of 1948. Does there come a point, has anybody you've spoken to amongst your former colleagues, your academic partners and your friends in Gaza and the occupied territories, have they ever said to you at any point that, okay, maybe this isn't worth it, we'd actually just like the bombs to stop and we can't suffer anymore? Or is there a feeling that actually in this moment in history, this is the time for the Palestinians to say enough, enough, enough? We need a resolution that will give us something for the future.
Well, I mean, first of all, no one wants bombs dropped on them, full stop. I mean, that's absolutely critical here. But the idea that Palestinians in any way will just stop or, you know, not resist or not stand up against this is absolutely never going to happen. The most steadfast people you can come across are the Palestinian people. So there's absolutely no way that this ends with people putting their hands up and saying, we give up. That's never going to happen. Absolutely, we need to have critical conversations about how we move forward. What does the future look like? But again, we have to keep returning to what the problem is. And if we're not prepared to say what the problem is, then you'll never get a resolution. The problem here is an illegal occupation sponsored by the West, an apartheid regime where some people's lives are not worth the same as other people's lives. That's it. You need to call it what it is. And if you're not prepared to say that, then there can't be a resolution. And Palestinians have been engaged in this process for years and decades and decades and decades of false attempts at peace building. We cannot allow that to be the next phase here. There needs to be genuine, serious conversations about what the future looks like. But you got to stop killing people. You got to stop dropping bombs. That's just unacceptable.
Okay, Brendan, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Don't go anywhere. To the United States, Hatem Bazian, Professor of Middle Eastern Cultures and Languages at the University of California, Berkeley, joins us. Hatem, thank you so much for your time. We're trying to get a few personal reflections and make this as much about the people as anything else. Because when you see the suffering, it becomes sometimes difficult for journalists, maybe academics like you, to separate that emotion from the analysis. I understand you've been traveling around the United States over the past few months lecturing about what's been happening in the Middle East. What sort of reception have you received? Because we know a lot of times when there is whatever sort of criticism it is of Israel, it's regarded as possibly being anti-Semitic.
Well, first, let me talk about on the personal level. I had students that lost many members of their family. I have a student that a number of occasions will text me, say, 3 more of my family, 7 more, 54 members of the Al-Qarra family, the Hijazi family. So how can you actually be, let's say, teaching while this is the feedback that you get from students who are sitting and studying modern Middle East and being in a lecture and to be able to process this. As far as the reception on college campuses, on the community, I think what we are witnessing is the student population, for the most part, has been overwhelmingly conscious of what is taking place, mobilized in a type of mobilization that possibly we have not witnessed since the challenge to the apartheid South Africa. And we are seeing students encampments that have developed over the last semester, and now the students are back organizing. Just this past Tuesday at UC Berkeley, the student government, the student council, voted a resolution on PDS calling for boycott, divestment, and sanction. Now, we understand that Israel's defensive mechanisms in the public arena and discourse is to label any critique and any type of activism as anti-Semitism. But I do feel that this turn, that this charge, this accusation is beginning to lose its luster, considering the massive visual images that we're getting, the massive documentary evidence that from Oxfam and others that shows almost the intentional genocidal campaign that has been committed. So it's very difficult for the pro-Israel spokespeople or those who want to defend Israel to continue to use this charge in the face of, for the first time possibly in modern history, a live stream genocide unfolding. The documentary evidence is not contested. It's basically the spin doctoring that is going around to try to continue to provide Israel the ability to unleash massive violence on the Palestinians with the support of much of the Western world, aiding and abetting. I no longer say complicity when I speak of the Western governments and world. I speak of partnership in the execution, in Israel's execution of the genocide, coordinating at every level and participating as co-partners in the unfolding genocide on the Palestinians.
Hatem, stay with us. Have a listen to this clip, okay? The continuing Israeli occupation, the blockade of Gaza, an expansion of illegal settlements on Palestinian lands, Tel Aviv's disregard for international law. Now, some may care to argue against these, but they are the reasons Hamas has given for its attack inside Israel on October the 7th. A senior member of the group, Osama Hamdani, spoke to TRT World back in December.
The Palestinians were being killed everywhere, every time in the Palestinian occupied territories. That means you have two options. Either you can do nothing and you will be killed by the Israelis, or to resist and they will kill you at the same time, but you will also resist them and you will show everyone that this cause is a real cause. It belongs for a nation called Palestinian people, and this land is a Palestinian land occupied by the Israelis, and this will make the international community moves forward instead of just watching the Israelis. And that happened too. Well, you can't blame the Palestinians. The third point, you can't blame the Palestinians for being killed by the Israelis. You have to start blaming the Israelis. You have to start talking about how the Israelis are killing the Palestinians, the civilians, destroying the infrastructure of the civilian community, destroying the houses, the schools, the mosques, churches, and hospitals. And instead of blaming the Palestinians for trying to defend themselves, start talking about how the Israelis are a very savage and nazist occupation, and instead of just blaming the victim for trying to protect itself, for trying to protect your own people and your own cause.
Even if the bombs stop today, many experts are certain the final death toll in Gaza will be far higher than the official number as it currently stands. Thousands of people are unaccounted for. They're either missing without trace or their bodies are buried under rubble. Almost amidst daily death and destruction, there are still some Israeli attacks which will be remembered for their particular brutality. 10 days into the conflict, as tens of thousands of people fled their homes in search of shelter, Israel targeted the Al-Alhi hospital in the early hours of the morning. As many as 500 Palestinians were killed, making it the single biggest massacre of the war. Israeli forces besieged Al-Shifa hospital twice for nearly 2 weeks in November and then another 2 weeks a few months later. More than 40,000 people had gathered around the hospital. They were taking shelter, believing its grounds were safe. After Israel raided the facility and finally withdrew its forces, that was April the 1st, more than 400 Palestinians had been killed, hundreds more injured, over 500 were arrested. There was July the 13th. Israeli forces attacked a tented campsite on the Gazan coast. It was initially set up, the area, by Israeli forces as a designated safe zone for displaced Palestinians. It's Al-Mawasi. It suffered repeated attacks. In a July the 13th assault, more than 90 people were killed and hundreds injured by one direct strike. Let's go back to Professor Hatem Bazian of UC Berkeley. Hatem, was this always going to happen at some stage, or is it happened now because of the leadership that we have in Gaza and the leadership we have in Israel? We have Benjamin Netanyahu and we have Hamas, who are so directly opposed to each other, and you could say literally want to wipe each other out. Is it that moment that has produced what we're seeing?
I take a much longer historical view of what is occurring. We're talking about Palestine that has been colonized beginning in 1917 by the British with their Balfour Declaration, Sykes-Picot Agreement. And then you have the Nakba that actually expelled and ethnically cleansed 750,000 Palestinians. And from that moment on, we continue to see the suffering and the erasure of Palestinian history, Palestinian suffering, and the world community to take responsibility for their incubation and imposition of Israel and Zionism on the Palestinians. So we speak about the 1982 invasion of Lebanon. Hamas was not present in 1982. We could speak of the first Intifada, where the development that occurred with massive violence committed against the Palestinians. We could speak of the 7 different campaigns that have been unleashed on Gaza by Israel. And in 2021, I have actually one of my students from Al-Qawlaq family, they lost 22 members of their family. So I think it's very important to understand that Israel does not want to have a Palestinian state. It wants to continue to expand. It wants maximum land and with minimum number of people, so that we speak of silent ethnic cleansing that has been going on for some time. Netanyahu, as well as I would say even when the Israeli left-wing Labour Party was there, likewise, they actually expanded settlement. From 1993, when the Palestinians signed the Oslo Agreement, thinking that they might actually reach into a two-state solution, the number of settlers were about 170 to 180,000. During the peace process, the number of settlers mushroomed to close to 700,000 in the occupied territories, and more land was lost during this period. So I think unless we begin to address the issues that Palestinians' desire for freedom cannot be a secondary issue, it should be the primary issue. The end of the occupation is the primary issue, it's not a secondary issue. The right of return of the Palestinians is the primary issue, it's not a secondary issue. And the Israelis, the Americans, and some of their allies in the West and in the region want to celebrate the Abraham Accords, maybe to open touristic areas, have joint athletic programs, and so on, while all along erasing and pushing the Palestinians aside. There cannot be any peace, any tranquility, any stability in the region unless and until the Palestinians' right to their land and their right to freedom, dignity, and ability to have their status as a people, indigenous people in their own land, we will not go anywhere. And Israel will continue to use violence, encouraged and supported by Western powers to do so. But as they say, you can't shoot yourself out of a colonial apartheid structure. South Africa realized this, and they understood the requirements to make change. And I don't know if Netanyahu or the current Israeli leadership or even earlier Israeli leadership will come to this recognition that you cannot have an apartheid settler colonial project in the 21st century.
Hatem Bazian, we appreciate the contribution. Thank you so much. Time to go to my colleague Imran Garda, who is in occupied East Jerusalem. Over to you, Imran.
Thanks very much, Adnan. As has been mentioned, October the 7th ignited not only the occupied territories, particularly Gaza, scale of death and destruction on an unimaginable scale. As you had mentioned, more than 41,000 Palestinians killed, tens of thousands injured, and the war spreading throughout the region. Within Israel itself, something that had been brewing for quite a while has also taken on a renewed energy. The deep division within the country between the secular and the religious. In many ways, there's been talk of the division between secular and religious among Palestinians and Muslims, but not a lot within Israel. That has become centerpiece within the country now, and Mohammed Al-Qasim has more.
War can unify a country, but that hasn't been the case in Israel. In the aftermath of Hamas's October 7th attacks, the deadliest in Israeli history, more voices have called on ultra-Orthodox Jews to pay their dues and join the army. The war has exposed a deep division within Israel, this time between its secular and religious population.
There has been a strong sense of anger at the ultra-Orthodox who do not serve in the army, which means that everybody else is doing extra long reserve duty. And so, ironically, that division between religious and secular Israelis on the one hand and the ultra-Orthodox, the most religious on the other, is the strongest one underneath.
Israel was divided even before the attacks of October 7, in the fallout from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's plan to overhaul the judiciary system that led to months of mass street demonstrations.
Prior to the war, and maybe one reason for Hamas's decision to attack Israel on October 7 was the division and the demonstrations, a huge demonstration in Israel against government plans to change the system, especially to reduce the power of the Supreme Court.
Netanyahu and his far-right coalition government appeal to a very specific demographic in Israel. Among them, the ultra-Orthodox religious parties and their followers. They are growing faster than any other, yet the seculars in Israel say they are not paying their fair share. Census data shows that the average ultra-Orthodox woman in Israel has 6.6 children, while secular women just 2. Many ultra-Orthodox Jews don't work or serve in the military, pursuing a life of religious studies instead.
The Torah, in my mind, has a supreme value, and it's important to strengthen and not weaken it. And sending draft orders in such a way unilaterally harms this important value, and we don't want it to happen.
As its military assault on Gaza continues, the Israeli army needs more personnel after suffering heavy losses in Gaza and against Hezbollah.
The army asks for thousands of soldiers now, and we must bring the religion Orthodox. They are not going to the yeshiva to learn. They must go to the army and do what all the other kids in their ages are doing. If my kids can go to the army, so everybody can go to the army. There's no other options.
The discontent between these two influential groups is growing rapidly, with the seculars want to limit the sway of their religious parties, but with more anti-government demonstrations demanding a ceasefire deal with Hamas to secure the release of the Israeli captives. Many warn that Israel faces its biggest threat from within, and if it's not dealt with swiftly, it will weaken the country, and even worse. Mohammed Al-Qasim, TRT World, West Jerusalem.
There's been a lot of focus on Gaza over the past year, but it should not be forgotten that in the occupied West Bank, the occupation has endured, continued, and there has been a lot of misery for the Palestinians living under occupation there. I'm in occupied East Jerusalem here, just a few kilometers away in the occupied West Bank, divided by security fence, a wall, checkpoints. Palestinians over there have endured raids, settler attacks, and an intensification of the conflict since October the 7th. Our colleague Fatin Alwan has been covering events in the occupied West Bank since October the 7th, and we go over to her now. Fatin.
Indeed, this was the deadliest year in the West Bank, with two remarkable points. First one was the rocket sky violence between settlers and against Palestinians inside of the West Bank, that we can say literally it spiked up to 70% if we compared it to most of the years before. More than 1,200 families had to evacuate from the Bedouin community in Area C, and that means 60% of the Palestinian land. That comes along as a shadow government work that most of Palestinians look at it, that Israeli government legally cannot take over the Palestinian land, so they gave the job to settlers to do the job by terrorizing, attacking, and forcibly displacing Palestinians by choice, by attacking and terrorizing, attacking their kids, their wives, and maybe killing some of them, as what happened in Betin. Zaina Tahan did this report about the victim of settlers inside of the West Bank, and it was a heartbreaking story. Let's listen to the story from Zaina.
Omar Hamid was just 1 year away from graduating high school when he was shot dead by illegal Israeli settlers. On April 13th, dozens of Israelis attacked his village of Betin, close to Ramallah, and opened fire at unarmed residents. 17-year-old Omar was killed with a bullet to the head.
In one day, there were 3 attacks on the village by settlers. There have been many settler attacks on Betin before October 7, but they weren't this barbaric. Today, the settlers attack with live fire and have a green light from the government.
Deadly violence by illegal settlers in the occupied West Bank has surged in parallel with the Israeli war on Gaza. Dozens of Palestinians have been killed and hundreds injured over the past year, with residents accusing Israeli troops of standing by and doing nothing to stop the attacks.
It doesn't make any difference to me. It doesn't make it easier if my son was killed by a soldier rather than a settler. There is only one side doing the killing. The danger is not just in Betin. It's dangerous to be in the streets, to go to work, even to be inside your house. But this doesn't mean we will bow to the pressure from the settlers and the army. They have the same goal of expelling us.
The Israelis that killed Omar emerged from the illegal settlement and military base of Beit Il just behind me in the city of Ramallah. And although the settlers attacked the village of Betin just 50 meters away multiple times on the same day, residents say the soldiers did nothing to stop them. Since the war on Gaza, the occupied West Bank has suffered from an unprecedented level of forced displacement, particularly in remote areas, as a result of settler and army attacks and restrictions. Some residents describe it as ethnic cleansing.
Settlers are no longer committing individual attacks here and there. Today they are launching organized attacks, waves of terror. In April, they attacked 36 different villages at the same time. Today, the settlers enjoy a favorable legislative environment. The occupation is not satisfied with merely providing logistical support. The heads of settler militias are the ones in power in the government today.
As the war on Gaza enters its second year, residents of the occupied West Bank living a 2-hour drive away believe that unless Israel is held accountable, there will be much more illegal settler violence to come. Zaina Tahan, TRT World, Ramallah, Palestine.
This is only one of so many stories that took place in the occupied West Bank, but let's talk about this with our guest, Assam Arouri from the General Commission of Human Rights, and Saad Nimr, a political analyst. Let's start with you, Ustaz Assam. So, can we talk about any human rights in the West Bank or in Palestine in general? And where was the big breaches that was recorded throughout the 75 years, plus the worst this year?
The situation in the West Bank is worsening long way before the 7th of October 2023. But what happened on the 7th of October accelerated the Israeli policies towards the West Bank in general. If we can summarize the situation, it is a political genocide what's happening in the West Bank, as the Israeli policy towards Palestinians has three pillars. The first is direct oppression by the Israeli occupation forces, and that's reflected by figures through the large arrests of more than 11,000 Palestinians, day and night incursions to the Palestinian communities, large demolitions and evictions in large segments of the West Bank. And the figures show that more than 730 Palestinians were killed since the 7th of October in the West Bank. 167 of them are children. And the second pillar is weakening the Palestinian Authority by putting economic pressures on the PA and the daily incursions that making the PA irrelevant to the situation and to appear in the face of Palestinians that they are unable to protect them in the face of all forms of violence that we are facing. And we think that this is politically aimed to create, pushing the PA to collapse, creating...
But what's the point? If Israel keeps on saying that they need a partner and they go into security coordination with the Palestinian Authority, and they say that we need them there to be strong, like in Jenin. There was a deal between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli to put 500 security officials to take control of dismantling the local bombs. If they want them to be there, and they need them to be there, why are they weakening the Palestinian Authority, especially in the incursion that takes place in the center of Ramallah, for instance? Yeah, that's the aim is they want the PA eventually to collapse, to create a situation of chaos that allows the transfer of Palestinians. It's not lifted from the agenda. And if we go back to what Smotrich, who is the finance minister and a minister in the Ministry of Defense responsible for the West Bank, the changes that he brought to the civil administration and to the area in the last 20 months, not only 21 months, since the inauguration of the current government in Israel, he offered Palestinians three options. The first is to accept Jewish supremacy in this part of the world, to live without rights, or to leave, or to be killed or arrested. That's the three options that they offer Palestinians. And the current situation, if I want to summarize, it's creating a case of slavery for Palestinians. And what's happening in the West Bank now is somehow looks like the situation in ancient Rome, where the masters can kill the slaves, they can confiscate their properties, they can torture them, and rape them without accountability. And we're seeing all this on the ground. Sorry for cutting you off, but this is where I want to ask Saad Nimr. And you're a political analyst, and you're teaching politics to new graduate students. How exactly can you explain what you're teaching when it comes to international law, with all the breaking through that Ustaz Saad talked about? How exactly can we make the difference? Is it a biblical war or is it a political war? Is Smotrich now taking us into the greater Israel, or we're playing it politics?
Well, it's both. as a matter of fact. On the one hand, it is political, and on the other hand, they are relying on the biblical methodology anyway, in doing these kind of things. The Israeli, and especially the right-wing Zionist religious parts and parties such as Smotrich and Ben Gvir, they hardly believe that all this land is theirs, and not only that, but they are even looking forward to control even more land in the region, not only in Palestine, to materialize the idea of Greater Israel, which is from Euphrates to Nile, from their point of view. But they are not sometimes, declaring that quite. Obviously, but at the same time, they are doing that on the ground, sometimes silently, but that's the aim. So from the political point of view, as Mr. Assam just said, they don't want even to see the Palestinians in the area, and they prefer to kick them all out and to make a huge transfer if they could. Maybe after the 7th of October, that gave them a little bit more of opportunities to do that by forcing Palestinians in so many ways. As you mentioned a minute ago, we are talking about more than 25 communities in Area C were forced to leave that area by the force either of the Israeli army or the settlers. And this is the plan from their point of view, to evacuate as much as they could of the West Bank. Now, the problem is that Netanyahu himself, as a prime minister, is going along with this kind of ideas and this kind of plan, because in 3 occasions, in press conferences and in his speech in the United Nations, he showed maps of greater or historical Palestine without any mentioning to the Palestinians or the West Bank, as if it is not there.
We tried to conquer it so many times. Thank you so much for your time. Back to you, Imran.
Okay, we've obviously got some connectivity problems with Imran in occupied East Jerusalem. Fathin Elwan there, just talking about the experience of people in the occupied West Bank and those daily, nightly raids that have happened almost every single day since October the 7th. International diplomacy and ceasefire talks, they have not been able to rein in Israel's actions. So throughout the past year, attention has turned to the top international court in the hope of some intervention. 2 separate matters have been contested in the International Court of Justice. Our correspondent, Melinda Nucifora, is going to be in The Hague all day. She has filed this report.
Far from the front lines, another battle is raging. The fight for justice.
We believe that without the intervention of this court, of the international community, we will see the total destruction of the Palestinian people in Gaza.
South Africa brought the first case to court in December, accusing Israel of contravening the Genocide Convention. More than 30 other countries, including Turkey, have since signed on to support the proceedings. 2 days of public hearings in January resulted in the court ordering Israel to adhere to 6 interim measures, including taking all steps to avoid genocidal actions and allowing the free flow of humanitarian assistance. But it stopped short of demanding an immediate ceasefire.
If one to look at the provisional measures separately and collectively, it gives the clear message that in order to do all the things that they're asking for, you need a ceasefire for it to happen.
Israel filed a response to the court in February, but it wasn't made public. It has, however, rejected the allegations.
There is a tragic war going on, but there is no genocide.
The ICJ has issued 2 additional sets of interim orders, including this in May.
Immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in the Rafah governorate which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that would bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part.
It could take up to 4 years for the court to reach a final verdict. All the while, Israel is accused of disregarding the interim orders, continuing its attacks unabated. The second matter before the ICJ also took years to resolve. It started back in 2022 with a resolution from the UN General Assembly asking the court for a legal opinion on Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territories. More than 50 countries and international organisations made submissions during public hearings in February this year, the largest number of participants in any single case in the ICJ's history. It delivered its advisory opinion in July.
By 11 votes to 4, is of the opinion that the State of Israel's continued presence in the occupied territory is unlawful.
But the court's findings aren't legally binding, and Israel has a history of ignoring advisory opinions.
What we are aiming for is to end the occupation. What we are aiming for is the materialization of the Palestinian state. What we are aiming for is for Israel, to be punished.
But with no enforcement arm at its disposal, there's a limit to what the World Court can achieve. Melinda Nusafora, TRT World, The Hague.
From The Hague to Nairobi, the capital of Kenya, of course, a discussion with Peter Herbert, now the co-chair of Bandung Africa and Society of Black Lawyers, also a retired judge. Peter, thank you so much for your time. Can you tell us how effective international law is when it allows or doesn't punish until now actions such as the Israelis are taking in Gaza and killing women and children and other innocent civilians?
I think it shows the impotence, in a sense, of the International Court of Justice on the ground, because court orders have huge moral and legal force. However, if they cannot be implemented and you have organizations on the ground in Israel ignoring them, like the Israeli Defense Force and Netanyahu pays scant regard at all, then it has to be backed up by sanctions. It has to be backed up by the refusal to continue to arm Israel, and most importantly, by the United States, which seems to have this myopic view of peace in the Middle East as having nothing to do with the Israeli government. And therefore, it really needs to give its unqualified support to rulings of the ICJ, European Union and others have to stop arming Israel, and that is the only thing that will put an end to this conflict.
As a lawyer and a judge, Peter, what about the words intent and proportionality when it comes to Israel's actions? What do you see there regarding those two particular words, intent and proportionality?
I mean, the evidence is overwhelming, and I think anybody who argues that it's not clearly doesn't know the reality on the ground. You cannot kill in excess of 50,000 civilians and argue that it's not disproportionate. You cannot, in Lebanon, the West Bank, Gaza, Jerusalem, kill countless civilians and argue that this is somehow accidental or collateral damage. Of course there is intent. And the terms for genocide are that you intend, in whole or in part, to destroy an ethnic group, or to create a situation where the demise is inevitable. And therefore, the legal and evidential requirements have been satisfied. And it is, in a sense, a tragedy that the international community is paying scant regard to this. And it really must, as I said before, be backed up by weapon sanctions. It cannot be done simply by wringing hands and by votes at the United Nations General Assembly. It has to be enforced.
What would the judges at the ICJ be doing in terms of their deliberations, what kind of evidence they're hearing from the lawyers representing to the two sides? Are these judges permanently based in The Hague, or are they only kind of part-timers who come and do their work when there is a case like this? What will they be doing and deliberating and examining right now?
Well, they'll be looking at all the evidence. I mean, there is huge evidence that is available, even from the videos and the testimony that the Israeli Defense Force itself has published, but also by independent organizations such as Amnesty International reporters such as TRT World and others who on the ground have done some excellent work in highlighting these injustices. So you look at what type of munitions are being used. Are these precision-guided bombs, so-called, or are they using 2,000-pound bombs to destroy apartment buildings? If you do that, then it's absolutely clear that you're intent on destroying civilians, not just the individual who is being targeted, but a whole apartment block, and giving people notices to remove themselves from locations, as they're doing it now in Beirut, is ridiculous. You know, it's almost like saying in Nazi Germany, well, let's get rid of all the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, leave, and we erase one part of it. That simply is not credible. So the mental element of this by those in charge, the generals, and in particular Netanyahu himself, who is really leading a fascist state. And the analogies with Nazi Germany grow by the day. I do hope that the International Court consider the necessity of a ceasefire, and all the evidence that they hear when they convene points in that direction. Not calling for a ceasefire would be in a sense, an abandonment of their legal and jurisdictional role and responsibility.
Peter Herbert, thank you so much indeed, Peter.
Thank you.
انتظار وصول المساعدات الاجتماعية.
يلا بطل. Don't forget why we're here!
The people of Gaza are just like you and me. They have hopes and aspirations, health, wealth, success, safety, security, understanding. They have dreams, just like you and me. But their nightmares are different. For most of us, our worst horrors are experienced in the mind. For Palestinians, they happen while they're awake, hearing death above their heads, feeling the shrapnel and the bullets, seeing the shattered limbs and the broken bodies. So actually, maybe Gaza's people are not like you and me. Maybe they're more. To live in the world's biggest open-air prison under a long-lasting blockade, being denied basic human rights and treated like a mortal threat by those pointing the guns at you. To do that and maintain one's dignity, to raise families, build communities, laugh, cry, and love, could you and I? My colleague and our correspondent Nizar Sadawi reported from Gaza during the first 6 months of the conflict. Tell us about that immediate moment as soon as you heard about the Hamas attack on Israel.
Well, as soon as I heard about the Hamas attack on Israel, I thought WW3 was happening, because we've seen so many military escalations, but nothing like that. That was absolutely unprecedented. It came out of nowhere, and there were thousands of rockets. There were Hamas members infiltrating for the first time in history, going into the Israeli territory. So I was very sure that the response will be severe, catastrophic even, and that's what happened. I just texted people here, our colleagues in TRT World, told them what happened, and drove my car to the office, woke everyone up, the crew, and then there was war.
Did you believe at that moment that possibly the life of every single resident of Gaza would now be in danger? Because you were thinking professionally at that moment. Your personal fears in terms of the people you love and the people you needed to get in touch with to say, this is happening, we need to be careful, do something to make sure you're safe.
That's the thing. You cannot keep them separate all the time, because I was reporting, and at the same time I was witnessing people, for example, escaping the death and the miseries and the destruction I was reporting on. So I've always been confused when I was there in Gaza, because I needed to check on my family. I needed to check on my girlfriend, know that they're okay, that they're safe. And because we're journalists, we often know when there's a strike in their neighborhood, for example. There were times when I was on air reporting, and I would get a message that my family's neighborhood is being bombed. The house right next to them had just been struck by the Israeli fighter jets. And I would just continue reporting, knowing that maybe when I say 13 people were just killed, maybe my family, I mean, they could have been some of these people. That happened many times. So no, we couldn't keep it separate, because after all, yes, we're journalists, but we're also human beings. We're part of that community. I'm a Palestinian, not just a journalist.
Do you consider in some way that you're actually lucky to be alive and standing here today?
Well, definitely much luckier than the rest of the 2.3 million Gazans, because we were not just reporting on casualties. We were reporting on dreams, hopes shattered, lives torn apart, entire families wiped out every day. Some of these families were our friends, some of them were our relatives. We saw that happening. And because we're journalists and we're human beings, like I said, we couldn't keep it separate, but I need to tell you one thing here, that losing family is hard, but the 179 journalists who were killed in Gaza, I mean, we were all family. We didn't see our family members. I mean, time was a luxury seldom afforded for us, and it was very risky to move. I had a car that was bombed, then I rented another car, and I couldn't visit my girlfriend. I couldn't go see my mother and my brother and sister, because I knew that if I go there with this vehicle that says press on its roof, I could be targeted, or they could be targeted, punished for being related to a journalist who's reporting on what was happening there. It happened to a lot of our colleagues. So we couldn't take that risk. I mean, my family spent 2 months in Gaza during the war before they left. And in these 2 months, I only visited them actually twice. The third time was the time I drove them to the crossing.
Okay, Nizar, we're just going to get a first-person account of one individual in Gaza. Professionals across the Strip, you a journalist, whether they be emergency workers, teachers, municipal workers, whatever they've been doing, they've been trying to do while staying alive and helping fellow Gazans to get through every day. But for a medical worker, It's become one of the most difficult jobs of all, simply because they're being targeted like everybody else, but they're being targeted while trying to help the injured. Let's have a look. This has been sent to us at TRT World, first-person account of this medic's daily life over the past 12 months.
I have a message to the war. It says we need urgent ceasefire. I'm Jamal Muhammad Salha, medical doctor from Gaza. I lived about 7 wars in Gaza from my birthday, I think from 7 wars. We are exhausted. I started my voluntary work in Shifa Hospital at the neurosurgery department. I'm from north of Gaza, and my family evacuated from my home at the 3rd day of the war. Now I am volunteering in Al-Aqsa Hospital at the neurosurgery department, and my family in a tent in Deir al-Balah. I wake up every morning at about 9 a.m. clock. Then I go to see my patient on my round morning in our neurosurgery department. Most of the cases we are seeing is critical. Most of it are explosive. The hospital itself exhausted, no medical equipment. The people in Gaza are so tired. They are living in a tent since 1 year. Before 2 weeks, I lost my brother. From the beginning of the war, I lost a lot of my friends, my close friends. This life is not our place. Our place in the heaven, inshallah. Another message from me to my friends who lost very high number of their families. I felt what you feel, but I can't do anything. I'm so sorry.
What was Gaza like before October the 7th?
Not normal, because, see, Palestinians have always longed for this sense of normalcy before the war. And they've always been waiting for a chance to lead a normal life, by all means possible. But they were never granted this, because this ongoing war, this isn't the first time Palestinians in Gaza have experienced this. They've had so many devastating experiences over the past 76 years, since 1948. That hasn't changed, nothing changed. In fact, it keeps getting worse. Every war that they experience is worse than the one before. That's the reality for Palestinians. But they never gave up, to be honest. So before this war started, before October 7, there were some times where, let me put it this way, things were relatively calm a few days before October 7. And when it's calm in Gaza, you could see hope amongst people, especially the young. And Gaza is a very young population. More than 50% of the population is a young population. So they've always had hopes that maybe the siege, the blockade will be lifted. Maybe they will one day have a sovereign independent state. Maybe one day they will have a passport that actually allows them to travel, to go anywhere else, to build careers, a future. But every time the hope is really high, it gets crushed by reality in Gaza. That reality is that Israel will never allow it to happen. They will never allow Palestinians to have a state. They will never allow them to dream and to hope and to have aspirations. This is the reality for every Palestinian in Gaza. So it was relatively normal, but again, for Gazans, normal isn't normal.
But the level of civilian death, it's the highest. You mentioned 1948. In the entire Arab-Israeli conflict, not a Gaza, not a Hamas, not a Palestinian conflict against Israel, but the entire Arab world's continuing tensions and conflict with the state of Israel, the level of civilian death in Gaza. What does that do to the survivors?
It ruins them. See, for Palestinians, I'm a journalist, but I'm also a Palestinian, a human being. And let me tell you this, loud and clear, this isn't just another chapter of the Israel-Palestine conflict. This is absolutely different. It ruined everything. It even ruined the hopes I was just telling you about. There's no more hope for Palestinians in Gaza because unlike every other military escalation they witnessed, this time they were not left with 20% of the infrastructure damaged, for example. 90% of the people in Gaza have become displaced, internally displaced. So what they have long heard about from their grandfathers, from their parents, for the old ones, about 1948 and the first displacement, it doesn't even compare to what they're going through now. In 1948, 750,000 Palestinians were displaced. We're talking about 2 million people now. There are no homes, no schools, no hospital, no nothing. And whenever they follow the news and suddenly they watch someone from the United Nations speaking about them, talking about them, saying that these people will need 15 years to rebuild homes. But what about lives? Can lives be rebuilt so easily as homes, as infrastructure? Because it's not about money. I mean, you can talk as much as you want about the millions or billions of dollars that you can use to fund Gaza and the reconstruction of Gaza. But you cannot explain this to someone who lost his loved ones, his children, for example. It's not about homes, it's not about cars, it's not about trees. It's about lives, it's about dignity, it's about a future that they once thought was possible, and now it's not. You and I are sitting here thinking that we're commemorating October 7, but we're not. We're commemorating thousands of lives that have been shattered by this ongoing war. We're actually, if you think about it, as a Palestinian, not as a journalist, we're commemorating the collapse of humanity.
Let's just hear a couple of clips from people in Gaza, and we'll continue. Let's just have a listen. They're just two of them, but they may speak for the majority of the people.
عايشين في مأساة. Our situation is catastrophic. I lost 2 of my little children. I don't know how else I can describe our difficult situation here. I no longer have any wishes. Maybe the only wish is not to lose any more of my little children.
The situation is very difficult and getting worse every day. We hope to return to our homes in the near future. Everyone wishes to return to their homes in the north. Everyone had a home and they now have nothing. We hope the war will stop.
You are on every hour, I mean, endlessly reporting on what's happening to people you know, the people you've lived with in your own community. When you put the microphone down, I'm particularly interested in what the younger generation was saying to you, because they would have seen that you're wearing a jacket which says press. They see you with the microphone, they see a camera, they know what you're doing. Would they come to you and talk to you and say what's on their mind? What was your interaction with those children that are seeing you working, that are talking to you?
Let me tell you one thing. In the beginning, for the first couple of weeks, I didn't really understand why would tens of children gather around me whenever I'm doing a stand-up position, a live hit. Because most of these people, they don't speak English, they don't know English, and we are TRT World. I was reporting in English. So I used to look at them and say, why are they here? I mean, they don't understand the word I'm saying, but yet they're really listening deeply, with full concentration. It was weird, really strange. And then after that, I began to understand. I began to comprehend that We were the only source of news, and they were that desperate because they didn't have electricity, they didn't have TVs, they didn't have internet. They had no means of knowing what was happening around them. So one day, I remember a child, a girl, she was like 10 years old or something, and she came to me after a live hit, and I asked her, honey, do you understand what I'm saying? Did you understand this? And she was like, no, but I look at your face and I understand when you're talking about people who died where. She thought I might point at Rafah, for example, or Khan Yunis, because her family lived there. She wanted to know whether her family was still alive or not. And then she asked me, I mean, these were children. They were asking me names I didn't know, obviously. I don't know the entire population of Gaza, but that's the case. We were the only source of news, and it became harder and harder when there was a blackout. I remember for the first time we witnessed a blackout in Gaza, I thought about it and I realized that there was no means of communicating, of telling the world what was happening. And I thought, maybe that's the purpose. Maybe this is why it happened. So I asked the technical team, can they still hear me if I speak to the microphone, although I cannot hear the presenter or anything? And I remember the next bulletin that day, it was you giving that bulletin, and you gave the message, because the thing is, I decided to give a message anyway. I just hoped that someone was listening and record the message. So I gave this message that we are experiencing a blackout, that we have no means of communication, we don't have internet, we cannot make or receive phone calls, and based on what I'm hearing from my sources on that ground, several incidents happened, and I just gave the news. And then the next bulletin, I managed to get something that looked like a radio, and I could finally hear the bulletin. And I heard you saying, our correspondent sent us this message because he's experiencing a blackout, and you aired it. And for us, me and my colleagues, it meant the world, because despite all the miseries we were living through, yes, we are resilient. We managed to somehow get the message out there. It worked.
You put your life on the line every single day. As we know, almost 180 journalists have been killed. And many people accuse Israel of deliberately targeting the journalists. Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied territories and for Palestine, says this is because Israel doesn't want any witnesses, which of course you journalists in Gaza have been, to what Israel is doing. But don't be a journalist for just a moment. Be a Gazan. Do the people of Gaza believe that this moment, this past year, is definitively going to decide their future, the one that they have been wanting for decades and decades and decades, which most of the world seems to support, their own state?
Palestinians in Gaza, especially in Gaza, have started to believe that it was never about them. They were just being regarded as collateral damage. That what is happening in Gaza and what has happened is just part of a bigger plan that involves the entire region, the entire Middle East, especially after what happened in Lebanon. I was talking to my friends there the other day, and one of them said, and this is a quotation, "Nobody cares about us anymore because there's war in Lebanon. We care about Lebanon just as much as we care about ourselves, but the thing is, no one's interested in our story anymore, and it's not about us. It never was." And I think on a personal level that he had a point, because it's clearly an Israeli plan to reshuffle the entire region. It's not about Gaza. It's not about Iran, it's not about Lebanon or Syria or Iraq. It's about everything, and it's about a politician on the Israeli side who's trying to save his career, his political career, no matter the cost. And the cost this time is hundreds of thousands of lives. But again, for them, just collateral damage.
And these are the things we're going to be addressing throughout these specials that we have here on TRT World this Monday, October the 7th. Nizar, for the moment, thanks very much. The Palestinian cause has many supporters. When an organization like Amnesty International accuses Israel of operating an apartheid system against Palestinians, that is a heavy charge. So how do governments that back the Palestinians react to a country that counts the world's greatest superpower as its biggest ally? Is criticism of Israel also an accusation of American complicity? One of the very strongest voices supporting the Palestinians is the Turkish one. Bera Karaman reports.
From the first day of Israel's onslaught on Gaza, Ankara has called on both sides for a lasting ceasefire and not to escalate tensions across the region. But despite that, with full support of Western countries, Israel escalated its military campaign, killing innocent Palestinians. In response, Turkey halted all trade with Israel, a significant move which was $9.5 billion.
There was a trade volume between us. Ignoring this trade volume, we closed the door.
In his efforts to stop the massacre, Erdogan has been in regular discussions with leaders from Qatar, Egypt, Saudi Arabia and Palestine to try to end Israel's killings. Turkey is the top provider of humanitarian aid to Gaza, dispatching more than 56,000 tons of aid.
A genocide is being committed just a few hundred meters from where we stand. There is no medicine, no water, no food. Palestinians are fighting hunger in the open air. If we don't stop this massacre together, humanity will be complicit in this tragedy. We must increase the pressure on Israel. Western states, especially the United States, must break their silence, or they too will remain complicit in this atrocity.
In November, a Gaza contact group was formed at a summit in Riyadh. The group includes Turkey, Jordan, Qatar, Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Its mission is to stop the conflict and work towards lasting peace. Earlier this year in April, President Erdogan met with Ismail Haniyeh, then Hamas political chief, in Istanbul. Following the meeting, the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas visited Ankara, addressing the Turkish parliament, vowing to work with all his power to stop Israel's barbaric aggression. And in September, Turkey submitted a bid to officially join the International Court of Justice genocide case launched by South Africa, alleging violations of the 1948 Genocide Convention. The Palestinian cause has long been central to the Turkish government's policies, and this solidarity runs deeply among its people. Nationwide protests have been held, with thousands demanding justice for Palestinians and to put an end on the ongoing atrocities. On the first anniversary of the war, calls for an immediate and lasting ceasefire are stronger than ever, urging global community to act and prevent further suffering. Bera Karaman, TRT World, Istanbul.
Betul Doğan Akash joins us now in the studio. She's an assistant professor in Middle East Studies at Ankara University. Betul, thank you so much for coming in. It's very early in the morning still in Istanbul. Why has the world been unable to stop Israel's violence?
That's a very important and tricky question that we actually tried to answer since the 7th of October last year. What I can say, the political forces, international organizations, the governments, the NGOs, the persons who are very active in politics all around the world, they actually try somehow very hard to do something tangible for Palestinian people, for people in Gaza, for anyone who is against that genocide. But there's this big influence of the counter forces who actually are not working or even like trying to function for a ceasefire or a peace process for the both sides in a short period of time. The understanding of a conflict or of a war in Palestine. It's somehow chronic now, and the suffering we watch on the TV, we witnessed since the 7th of October, it's like as if this is somehow, it's going to go for a long term, and the reason is not something that we actually can change by politics. I don't agree with that. If we have a functioning politics all around the world, including international organizations and like states who could actually somehow encourage Israel to change things or force anyone who is involved, we could see a tangible change. We have a biased politics. What we have seen in Ukraine, okay, we haven't seen a peace in Ukraine as well, but we have seen a better discourse, a potentially functioning discourse in other parts of the world. But when we come to the Middle East, we have seen this global narrative, which actually in somehow they are trying to function, which I see a better and encouraged discourse. But on the other side, what we see is more like this is chronic, and can we really change? They don't seem like acting in a way to bring a tangible solution, a solution to everyone. It's more like trying to not ignore, but like trying to normalize things going on. I think this is the unfortunate situation we face since the last year, more than before. Like
Benjamin Netanyahu says the International Court of Justice is anti-Semitic. He says the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees is anti-Semitic. It was a few years ago, the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan told the UN General Assembly, he held his hand up, he put 5, he said the world is bigger than 5, because the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, they could be accused of not conducting policies that are conducive to peace. And Recep Tayyip Erdogan now has the greatest champion for change in the current UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. Is it the Americans who are stopping the Security Council who are stopping the Security Council for demanding Israel stop its violence?
It has many layers. Since the last year, we have seen both Middle Eastern states and states from Global South. They actually try to lobby with the states to function, like to have a better functioning UN for Palestine. And it is not a new story. As you know, the conflict we have seen in this region, it's a long-standing conflict, but not only for this, for any other problem in the world, where we will see these big powers working for the people who actually need urgent help, not only for war. Okay, war is now in front of our eyes. We have seen a genocide since the last year. It's something we see. But let's say any other problem in any other part of the world, why we are always demanding a solution from those powers? We actually do nothing but just talk about things that we cannot, they say we cannot change, we don't have this influence, we cannot do this institutionally. But then what to expect from United Nations? As you mentioned, every action or every narrative of Guterres is labeled as anti-Semitic by Israeli political elites. Is this really the case? Of course not. He's trying to bring something for Palestine, for Gaza. And this is actually very global now, anywhere in the world. When you mention about peace or a solution, there's always a critical eye on any politician. And I think we will have a spillover effect of it. Once any politician is trying to do something on that cause, they might have a domestic problem if any other political group in their country is opposed to that, because we have far right increasing their influence in the West, but we have also somehow less orientation to regional problems in the other part of the world. We have China, Russia involved to Middle East problems, but they don't like bringing a completely different alternative narrative to Middle East conflict. So who else to solve this then, if we cannot rely on international organizations? So this is very unfortunately problematic.
Maybe individual governments like the Turkish government, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, again, just a couple of days ago, making a speech to the ruling party, the AK Party, speaking to them in Ankara, saying that, remember, we have taken economic measures against Israel, cutting all trade with the state of Israel, but so few have done that. Why not more?
We have, what I see mostly, they are trying to have the rule dependent on the international organizations or international law.
So in other words, relying on other people to make decisions for them?
Yes. Yes, but at the same time, what we see is the functioning, as you mentioned, the functioning mechanism is actually oriented from the local narrative. So as you mentioned, Turkey has a specific stance on it. We have other Middle Eastern countries or global South countries. They do support Palestinian people. They also don't have trade with Israel, but this is a few. The problem here is we don't have a solid, unified international sanction on Israeli trade or any sort of functioning mechanism that might actually provide a certain challenge, so they might think of changing their policy making. This is a problem, but Turkey definitely, as you mentioned, Turkey is trying to bring a different narrative in many ways. They are trying to provide humanitarian aid, they are hosting the Palestinian people who need urgent health care, they are trying to internationalize the conflict with the war crimes, etc. But they also try to bring more regional voice. We have Egypt involved, Qatar involved, because if you don't have enough local source to make a change, you will be an external as a Western power or as a Turkey, as another country in the Middle East, but not part of that conflict. Then how you're going to make sure that this is actually a long-standing peace process? So Turkey is aware of the fact that we need a local agency. This is why actually Qatar, Egypt involved heavily, but we haven't seen any tangible outcome yet.
Betel Dornakash, I know you're with us for many hours because it's going to be a day of special coverage throughout October the 7th. For the moment, thank you so much indeed.
Thank you.
Time now to go to Beirut because this is another front that has opened up in Israel's aggression across the region. In fact, recently Benjamin Netanyahu is saying that his country is fighting on 7 different fronts. Certainly Lebanon is one of the main theatres of war for the Israelis. Our correspondent Priyanka Navani is in Beirut. Priyanka.
Adnan, just one day after Israel and Hamas began fighting, so too did Israel and Hezbollah. For months, this was fighting that was described as low level, but in mid-September, things took a turn for the very deadly. We are now at a point where over 2,000 people in Lebanon have been killed and the fighting rages on. Just about an hour ago, there was a big explosion in the southern suburbs, which is to my left. Many people have described this fighting now in Lebanon as Gaza-like. Nobody, I think, believed that we would ever get to this place in Lebanon. But to take a look exactly at how we did get to this place, let's take a look at this package, A Year in Review in Lebanon. When Hezbollah fired rockets into Israel on October 8th last year, it said it did so in support of the Palestinian people and its ally, Hamas. But it soon turned into something even bigger as Israel attacked targets in southern Lebanon and Hezbollah fired back. By December, tens of thousands of Lebanese had fled their border villages, despite being ill-equipped to do so, given Lebanon's crippling, ongoing economic crisis. As the months went on, Israeli strikes got larger and penetrated deeper into the country, from the eastern Bekaa Valley to the far north.
We are civilians. What do we have to do with any of this? We condemn Israel for the crime it's committing against civilians.
By June, embassies were warning against travel to Lebanon. The warnings were largely ignored until July, when a dozen children were killed in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights, which Israel blamed on Hezbollah. Hezbollah denied involvement, but Israel nonetheless hit Beirut days later, assassinating top Hezbollah commander Fouad Shukr and killing and injuring dozens of civilians. Thousands fled Lebanon with fears of all-out war.
Yes, we tried to leave as soon as possible and picking among the flights, the available flights.
In mid-September, those fears were realized. Thousands of walkie-talkies and pagers belonging to Hezbollah members detonated across Lebanon in a span of 2 days, injuring thousands. The Israelis did not let up, quickly expanding their operations, culminating in the assassination of Hezbollah's longtime Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah on September 27th.
He is the father, the mother, the brother. He is everything in this world. There is nothing left now. We were relying on him and he was our role model.
Days later, the Israeli army began what it described as limited-scale incursions into Lebanon, marking their 4th ever invasion attempt and the first since 2006. Hezbollah says its fighters forced the Israelis to retreat. Now, as Israel dominates the country by air, Hezbollah promises to defend the land, and the international community and Lebanese government calls for a ceasefire. The Lebanese people await their fate.
For sure, there is fear. Everything is getting worse and going backwards. The country is damaged. It was damaged before, and now it is damaged more. Nothing is improving.
Now, Hezbollah is not the only group in the region that has attempted to support the Palestinians during what many have called this genocide in Gaza. The Houthis of Yemen have also taken up this mission of supporting the Palestinians. For more on this, I'm joined by my colleague Yusuf now. He joins us from Yemen. Yusuf, what has the last year in Yemen been like?
Well, in Yemen, people are in preparation for an all-out war that the Ansar Allah Houthi group says is fully prepared for. They have prepared a stockpile of weaponry ranging from long-range, mid-range, and short-range missiles, ballistic missiles, drones, and of course, hypersonic missiles. They've also prepared unmanned drones that they use to target ships in the Red Sea, Israeli-affiliated ships, U.S.-affiliated and British-affiliated vessels. They prepared mini submarines, and they've also prepared the unmanned surface vehicles, also known as drone boats, which explode upon impact. We have prepared this package to cover the Ansar Allah Houthis' military capabilities and the military actions they have taken over the past year.
The Ansar Allah movement in Yemen, commonly known as the Houthis, has drawn significant attention over the past year due to its military involvement in the Israeli-Gaza conflict. In November of 23, the Zaidi group made headlines by seizing the Israeli-linked vessel Galaxy Leader in the Red Sea. According to the group, this marked the beginning of the Yemeni-imposed blockade on all Israeli shipments until the war in Gaza ends. Despite this, Israel refused to cease hostilities, prompting the Yemeni group to escalate its military operations at sea. They targeted all Israeli-affiliated vessels, including several U.S. and British warships.
These operations in the Red Sea and surrounding waters have achieved a partial blockade on the Israeli entity. It will be a full blockade if Arab regimes didn't step in to save Israel by opening a shipping lane to Israel via land. Now we are in phase 5, which aims to hit the security of Israel, and we do this by targeting Tel Aviv.
The military escalations have transformed one of the world's most crucial international shipping lanes, Bab el-Mandeb, into a volatile battle zone. According to U.S. officials, this poses a significant threat to global trade.
The United States will continue to hold the Houthis accountable for their attacks, which have not just disrupted international commerce, not just disrupted the freedom of navigation in international waters, and not just endangered seafarers, but now tragically killed a number of them. So we will continue to hold them accountable, and we call on governments around the world to do the same.
Ansar Allah, however, argues that the U.S. should be held accountable for supplying Israel with weapons used to commit war crimes across the region. In the latest attack, Israel carried out airstrikes on the Yemeni western port of Hodeidah, killing 5 and injuring more than 50 Yemenis.
We consider this aggression, whether on Palestine, Lebanon or Yemen, to be a U.S. and British aggression. The Israeli entity is a military wing of the U.S. and the U.K. used by them to evade responsibility for the lives lost. They can also continue to support Israel politically and militarily while remaining far from being attacked. We, the Arab and Muslim world, must change our military approach to confront the U.S. and U.K. directly.
In an escalation of tensions in the region following the assassination of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, the Zaidi group in Yemen has declared open war on Israel. It is threatening to target Tel Aviv and any Middle Eastern regime that is collaborating with Israel. Many experts believe this is a clear indication that a regional war is unavoidable, a war that could even drag in nations from beyond the region itself. Yusuf Maudi, TRT World, Sana'a.
Well, the Ansar Allah Houthis are actually threatening to escalate their military attacks against U.S. and Israel, not just hit Tel Aviv and not just target Israeli ships in the Red Sea. They're also threatening to target all U.S. and Israeli interests across the region. As always, we will keep you updated from the latest out of Yemen, but for now, let's take you back to Brianka.
Thank you so much, Yusuf. Now, another common link between Hezbollah here and Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen, beyond their support for Palestine, is that both of these groups are trained, funded, and supported by Iran. For more on this, I'm joined by my colleague Reza. He's joining me from Tehran. Reza, we know that Tehran supports these groups like Hezbollah and the Houthis, but what role, if any, did Tehran play in the planning of the October 7th attack? Were they involved directly?
Yes, Priyanka. Iran was quick to defend the October 7th attacks by Hamas against Israel. But at the same time, Iran made it clear that it had no role in planning or executing the October 7th attack. Iran said the attacks were logical, legal, and legitimate, but reiterated that it had no role in the attacks. Iran leads a coalition of anti-US, anti-Israeli forces in the region, from Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, as well as Houthis in Yemen and militias in Iraq and Syria. But it has tried to stay away from the conflict. We have this report on Iran-Israeli tensions over the past year.
Jubilant scenes on the streets of Tehran hours after Hamas attacked Israel on October the 7th, 2023. Government supporters saying they're hopeful that the Al-Aqsa flood operation by Hamas could spell the end of Israel. Iran supported the Hamas attack and said Palestinians had the right to defend their land against Israeli occupation and continued assault. But Tehran said it had no role in the attacks, even though it has close relations with Hamas and supports it militarily and financially.
Supporters of the usurping regime have been talking nonsense in the past 2 or 3 days. For example, they say that Iran is behind this. They are mistaken. Of course we support Palestine. We support their fight. We kiss the hands of those who planned the attack and the brave Palestinian youth. But those who say non-Palestinians were behind this are mistaken.
But a couple of months into the war, Israel began targeting Iranian individuals and assets. Senior military advisor Sayed Razi Mousavi was killed in an Israeli airstrike in Syria in December. Tehran said Israel would pay a price. In January, Iran's Revolutionary Guards said they attacked the Mossad headquarters in the Iraqi Kurdish region in response. In April, an Israeli strike on Iran's embassy in Damascus killed senior Revolutionary Guards commander General Mohammad Reza Zahedi and 6 other officers. Tehran said a red line had been crossed and pledged to retaliate.
The evil regime, which is full of vice, wickedness, and errors, added another mistake to its list of mistakes by attacking the Iranian consulate in Syria. Consulates and embassies in other countries are regarded as the soil of that country. When they attack the consulate, it is as if they have attacked our soil. The evil regime made a mistake and must be punished, and it shall be.
A few days later, Iran launched its first direct attack against Israel using hundreds of drones and missiles. In July, Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated at his top security residence in northern Tehran. Iran said he was killed by a projectile in a Mossad operation. Haniyeh was in the Iranian capital to attend the inauguration ceremony of the country's new president, Masoud Pezeshkian. And assassination of key Tehran ally Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon crossed another Iranian red line, prompting Iran to launch another direct attack on Israel in retaliation, significantly raising tensions.
Netanyahu's doctrine is to create a crisis against another crisis. As Israel struggled with the Gaza crisis, he tried to spread the crisis to other areas like Iran and Lebanon. He's implementing this plan at the moment by creating a crisis in Lebanon. Netanyahu wants to start a regional war, bring in the US to the region for a conflict against Iran.
The stakes are high as Iran and Israel trade blows. The cycle of attacks and counterattacks have led many to believe an all-out war may be imminent. Tehran says it doesn't want war, but it cannot stay silent in the face of Israeli provocations. It says only a ceasefire in Gaza can bring peace and security to the region. Reza Hatami, TRT World, Tehran. So far, Iran has pursued a policy of brinksmanship toward Israel, a policy of no war and no peace. But it has been engaged in a cycle of attacks and counterattacks against Israel recently, and there are fears that it might lead to an all-out war. Let's go back to Beirut and have a perspective from Lebanon, where Iran's key ally Hezbollah has suffered major losses recently. Priyanka.
Thank you so much, Reza, for breaking that all down for us. To analyze these things further, and particularly to understand Iran's role in what we have seen in the region over the last year, but in particular the last couple of weeks, I'm joined now by Professor Luciano Zaccatta. He joins me now from Doha. Professor, I'm interested in knowing, we have seen, I think, a willingness from Tehran and Iranian allied groups over the last year to engage within the rules of engagement. There seems that there is not a willingness to go to full-blown war. But at the same time, we are seeing very provocative attacks on Hezbollah leaders and infrastructure here in Lebanon. We have also heard Israeli leaders talk about what a big attack they are planning on Iran. What is Iran's tipping point?
Well, the most important thing is that Iran keeps saying that they don't want a full-scale war because, of course, Iran doesn't want to engage in a war that will basically destroy their economy and that will keep them isolated. We have to bear in mind that the IRGC, which is the main army that is developing this, making these attacks, is considered as a terrorist organization by the United States and some other countries. Therefore, anything that Iran does, shooting missiles or participating or supporting other groups, is considered terrorism. This will make Iran to be much more isolated, to break any other relations that they have with the Western countries and maybe with non-Western countries as well. So Iran is trying to manage this pressure that is exerting on Israel, trying to contribute with the effort of Hezbollah with this war without engaging directly. They did it 2 times already with Israel, which was the first time in April, the first time that Iran attacked directly Israel. But again, even though it was a state announcing an attack against another state, it is still considered a terrorist attack by the United States and by other states. So Iran is trying to manage this, keep a balance between direct engagement and indirect support to other groups. We have to bear in mind also that every time Israel attacked Iran in its territory, they never claim it because they don't want to leave the precedent that Israel is recognizing that they attacked Iran. On the other hand, Israel keeps recognizing when they attacked the Houthis or Hezbollah that they are non-state actors, that they are also considered as terrorist organizations by the Western countries. So this is a matter of how
Thank you, Professor, for breaking that all down for us. I want to toss it back now to our main studio in Istanbul with Adnan Nawaz.
Okay, Priyanka, thanks very much indeed. Unfortunately, another technical problem there with the connection between Beirut and Doha and Professor Luciano Zaccatta. We can go to London and speak to Azam Tamimi, the author of Hamas Unwritten Chapters. Azam, thank you for your time. Can you take us back to almost 20 years ago when the people of Gaza voted in Hamas and what that changed in the minds of the Israeli government? Because something definitely seemed to change in its understanding of its relationship, continuing relationship with Gaza, but it changed because Hamas was in power now?
Well, indeed, the victory by Hamas in the 2006 elections came as a surprise, not just to the Israelis, but to many observers around the world. Now, that election, although was pressed upon Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, by the then US President George W. Bush, it was actually the first ever fair legislative elections to be held in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And as a result, the Israelis went to the Americans and said to them, we shall not recognize the result of that election, and we shall not deal with the victor in that election unless they agree to three conditions. And this is what became known eventually as the International Quartet conditions: that Hamas should recognize Israel's right to exist, that Hamas should disarm and renounce violence, and that Hamas should accept all agreements signed between the PLO and Israel. Of course, Hamas refused to accept any of this. And since then, the Gaza Strip was put under siege by the Israelis and their supporters.
I want to read you just a little brief piece from a former Israeli soldier who is now a professor in the United States. His name is Omar Batov. He says he doesn't go back to Israel that often, but he was back last year. And he said, what I see in Israel is that the majority of people don't know or even want to know about what's happening in Gaza. He says this desire is reflected in TV coverage. Israeli television news these days usually begins with reports on the funerals of soldiers who are described as heroes fallen in the fighting in Gaza, followed by estimates of how many Hamas fighters have been liquidated. He says references to Palestinian civilian deaths are rare. They're normally presented as part of enemy propaganda. And he says there's a deafening silence here about the suffering of the Palestinian people, which Omar Batov says it seems to be its own form of vengefulness. How much have the Palestinian people been dehumanized by the Israeli government here?
Well, this has been going on for almost 100 years now. It's not new. And this is also not unheard of in the struggle of people for freedom and human dignity. In South Africa, the white apartheid minority regime also created some sort of a bubble in which the white residents of South Africa continued to live until apartheid as a regime collapsed. They thought that this was God given to them, the land. They thought that God gave them license to enslave and persecute and oppress the indigenous population. This is exactly the same mentality that most of the inhabitants of the Zionist state have. And of course, there have been a few exceptions. There have been a few courageous individuals who have gone against this and who are alerting the rest of the world to the true nature of this Zionist entity. But I regret to say that the majority of the Zionists still living in Palestine, occupying my land and the land of my ancestors, are so adamant that they have every right to do to the Palestinians what they've been doing all along.
Speak to us personally, Azam, if you don't mind, about the things that people are telling you that they're experiencing. And I mean, let's not even bother about the helplessness that you and anybody who's not living there in Gaza or the occupied territories feels, because that is the only overriding issue for us who are outside of those areas, is helplessness. But you have lived it, you know people, it's part of you. What is it doing to you?
Well, well, to start with, I left Palestine at a young age. But of course, most of my family are still living there, and we hear from them and we meet them. I meet them regularly in my house in Jordan. I cannot go and visit my ancestral land and my relatives, but they come and visit us. Now, in a nutshell, the Zionists don't consider the Palestinians to be equal human beings. And that's enough. Once the other is not human enough, then you can do to them whatever you want. And that's why there are two sets of laws in Israel, one for the Zionists or the Israelis, and one for the non-Israelis, the Arabs, the Palestinians. To just tell you, my grandfather once was going into town with his donkey, and the Israeli soldiers or group of Israeli soldiers stopped him, and they asked him about his ID card. So he pulled his ID card and presented it to them, and then they started laughing, whispering to each other. And one of them said, "What about the donkey? Where is his ID card?" Making fun of my grandfather. And he answered them and said, "Well, why don't you ask the donkey for his ID card?" See, the way, I mean, the killing that is happening in Gaza, that has been happening over the past 12 months, could only be explained in this sense, that the Palestinian human being is not human enough for these Zionists. And that's why they justify their continued occupation. And I think this is what is so significant about what happened on the 7th of October. Since the 7th of October, and for the first time, the Palestinian narrative has been reaching the world in ways that never happened before. And now the world knows a lot more about the nature of Israel as a Zionist state and about the conflict. This conflict has never been about a territorial dispute. It's not that we were neighbors and we suddenly had a dispute over who has what. This has never been a religious dispute even. It's not between Muslim and Jew, because Jews lived in Muslim lands for thousands of years. There was no problem there. This is another imperialist colonial settlement project. That's what it is. And like what the French tried to do in Algeria, what the white minority tried to do in South Africa, this is exactly what the Zionists are doing in Palestine. And that's why I'm confident, and despite all this this pain that the Palestinians are feeling at the moment, despite the enormous cost, I am optimistic that we are seeing the beginning of the end of this other colonial project, just like the French colonial project in Algeria came to an end, and just like the American colonial project in Vietnam and in Afghanistan came to an end, and just like apartheid in South Africa came to an end.
Azam, is it naive, and if it is, please tell me, is it naive to ask you if Israelis and Palestinians can ever be friends?
Not with Zionism. It's impossible. And this is exactly what Nelson Mandela said to the white minority apartheid regime in South Africa when they went to talk to him in his prison cell. They said to him, "Let's work it out. How can we work it out?" And they had various proposals, Bantustans, a silly, helpless, dependent state for the blacks next to the powerful, hegemonic state of the whites. And Nelson Mandela said to them one thing: end apartheid and then we can talk. And this is exactly what will have to happen in Palestine. End Zionism and then we can talk. We have no problem with living with the Jews. The Jews lived with us before. This is about the invaders. Those who invaded us, took our land, and denied us our rights because of an ideology. And that ideology, which is Zionism, says that if you are Jewish, then you are superior, then you can come from anywhere in the world, from the Ukraine, from Poland, from South Africa, from North America, from Europe, anywhere in the world, and immediately become a full-fledged citizen. And you can take Azzam Tamimi's land, you can take his father's house, you can take his mother's house, and so on. Zionism is the problem. And this is actually what many people now are realizing. They can now understand why we are having this conflict. It's because of this sinister ideology.
Azzam Tamimi, thank you very much indeed, sir. Appreciate your time. You're watching a TRT World special coverage of October the 7th, marking 1 year since the start of the Hamas attack inside Israeli territory, and then the devastating response from the Israeli military, which is, of course, accused of committing genocide and war crimes against millions of innocent civilians in Gaza. And these are the live pictures that we have of the enclave on Monday, October the 7th, 2024. We'll be back in a very short moment. We're just going to take a break on TRT World, but please stay with us.